All right, let's start talking about compliance. So at a very high level, compliance is simply technical controls or policies that you implement within an environment to establish a baseline of security. And the reason you do it is because you're part of a community. That community provides critical resources, critical infrastructure, or protects sensitive data. For example, if you want to take and process credit card information, then you need to be compliant with the payment card industry standard. And the way that the community ensures that its members are compliant is through regular audits. And then based off of the outcome of these audits, there could be a financial fine for non-compliance. Recently, an electric grid company was fined $10 million for non-compliance. Additionally, in the payment card example, if I've proven that I am unable to protect that sensitive information, my access to that data will be lost. So because of these sanctions, a lot of organizations have started investing heavily into compliance programs, either hiring consultants, bringing on full compliance and governance teams, or as we see at the RSA conference this week, we have vendors selling compliance, whether it's consulting or it is pre-compliant solutions that are plug and play. So it's easy for an organization to sort of get lulled into a false sense of security when you're buying secure solutions and you have a 15-person governance team that looks at your compliance standards. However, you have to remember what the definition of compliance standards were: a baseline of security, so you're not invulnerable to cyber attacks, even though you've invested a lot of resources into it. Additionally, compliance standards are meant to be used as abstract concepts that security practitioners will take and implement as a technical control that's tailored to the organization. Somehow, over the past couple of years, a lot of these have been translated from compliance standard directly into a checklist of that compliance standard. And weird things start happening when you take abstract ideas and interpret them literally. So that's what we wanted to look at in our study. Given perfect compliance, what are the vulnerable conditions that you take on only because you are compliant? So we looked at three compliance documents that impact everyday Americans: how the IRS protects your federal tax information, how the payment card industry protects credit card data, and then lastly, how the electric grid provides safe, reliable power like we're enjoying right now. So we did this through three steps that we'll talk about during the study. The first of which is we sort of flipped the audit paradigm on its head. Instead of taking compliance documents, going to an organization and seeing how compliant they are, we had researchers actually audit the compliance standards looking for security issues. And what we call a security issue is something that when you read it and you implement it as is, that it creates a substandard security condition in the environment. And then we exported all of our findings to industry experts that live and breathe compliance day in and day out. And lastly, we disclosed our findings to the community to help bring increased awareness. So going back to our audit methodology, our 6 researchers that we had looking at the standards averaged about 14 years of hands-on experience with security, either as a pen tester, we had a privacy law expert, and security consultants. And when we were looking at these standards, we wanted to anchor all of our findings based off of our previous experience or things that we saw in the news. Additionally, we wanted to take a step back from our findings and help look at, what are the root causes? Why are these happening over and over again across multiple documents? So we adopted the composite risk management framework, which allows us to look at an issue and assign a risk estimate to it. The way that you read this is looking at the x-axis, that's the probability of an event occurring. You look at the y-axis, that's the severity of the event occurring within the environment. So an example real quick, something happens multiple times a day, every single day, we say that's frequent. And when that event is exploited, it causes a critical impact to the organization. So go across critical over to frequent, we can see that is an extremely high risk to an organization. And so once we did this for all of the security issues, we then sent it to industry experts to evaluate it. We had chief information security officers. We actually had one of the co-authors for one of the documents that we had assessed, and we wanted to get them to confirm or deny our findings in real environments. Had they seen the vulnerable conditions that we're talking about previously? Additionally, we wanted to garner additional context that we might not have had because we don't live and breathe it. And if you want to talk more about that additional insight during the Q&A, we can. And lastly, we wanted to partner with the people responsible for making the standards, the people using the standards, and exercise the existing vulnerability disclosure programs to talk about our findings and make others aware of it. So let's jump into some results. Across the 3 standards, we found 148 security issues ranging from low risk all the way to extremely high risk. We found 4 root causes across those 148 issues. And we want to give you some concrete definitions and examples of what we're talking about with these. So jumping first into a data vulnerability. This is something that just invites an attacker in and puts your data at risk. And there's multitudes of these across these standards. One that I want to highlight to you real quick is in the payment card industry, where it makes provisions that the only time the PCI security standard has to be implemented is in the network segment that has cardholder data. The rest of the environment can be wide open, 0 passwords, whatever you want. And what this does is invites attackers into your environment with a nice pillow landing, and then allows them to pivot into your network and exfil sensitive data. Our recommendation on fixing this is to extend those protections to the entire network, so it makes it a little bit harder for an adversary to get into your network. Another example of a data vulnerability is that the electric grid compliance standards actually have something that's variable security, in that the high production facilities that produce a lot of energy have to have the most stringent security controls in place, whereas the medium and low production facilities can have a subset of those controls. This is horrible in that a lot of this information is publicly available. So all you have to do is go to the NERC website, download the security standards, use publicly available information to find out who the medium and low producers are across North America, and then to start to understand what control measures are most likely not in place at each facility, and systematically target these facilities based off of the controls they probably won't have. So our recommendation, deploy all of those standards across all facilities, regardless of how much power they produce. So next one is, there's some conflicting information in the document that leads to something being unenforceable. So the IRS requires multiple barriers, whether it's an attack dog, whether it's a barbed wire fence, whether it's a vault that you're using to protect your federal tax information. But in the same document, it makes provisions for people to remotely access this from home. So who's going to everyone's house and ensuring the attack dog is up to snuff and that the vault on their bedroom door is in code with compliance standards? That's a hard problem to get over. And so there's one of 2 things that you can do to mitigate this. One, is the physical security controls absolutely necessary? And if it is, then get rid of all your remote access unless you can verify that the remote access facility is compliant. Additionally, if the physical access controls are just nice to haves, move them into a complementary document. Hey, here's our recommendations, and deploy things like the bring your own device technologies that puts everyone in a safe security container so that you can access the data safely and save some dollars. So there's another type of vulnerability that we found called an underdefined process, which means there's simply a step missing when they're telling you to do something. So the IRS requires that you do a component inventory. You can think of this as building a network map for everything that's installed, everything that's running on your network. However, it fails to describe how to adequately do this from a ground truth. And the problem here is it allows an attacker to gain physical access to your network, plug something in like a Pony Express, gain remote access to your environment the day before you do your network component inventory. Then you're whitelisted persistently into the environment as a legitimate user forever. That's a problem. And so our recommendation for fixing this is to adopt something like the site reliability engineering fundamentals, where you have a hardware component inventory, where you know what you purchased, you know from a baseline that should be on your network. And then you deny all by default, and then to start incrementally whitelisting as additional devices that should be on your network. I'm not naive to think that this is a hard thing to do. It is, but just sort of hand waving the problem away is not a solution. And the last sort of problem that we found is called, or we call, an ambiguous specification. So we're going to walk you through a couple scenarios using company A and company B. An ambiguous specification means that both companies can read a standard interpret it multiple different ways, have multiple different implementations, and still be compliant while they're wildly insecure. So let's look at the IRS's requirement to have access control policies validated every 3 years. And the other one is that the payment card industry requires you, after a pen test, to deal with all of the issues that they find as a result of that. So Company A has someone that's been doing access control for 10 years. They went to access control school, they graduated top of their class, and they know what they're doing. And they're the ones that sign off on it. Whereas Company B, they don't really know what to do about it, so they go to the bagel vendor in the front lobby, and they have them sign off on the same document. So Company A knows that they just had a pen test, and they found 10 findings, 3 of them critical, that within 30 days they need to address all those critical vulnerabilities, and within 45 get to the rest. Whereas Company B waits 364 days before the next pen test, puts it off, deals it the day prior. In these scenarios, both Company A and Company B are compliant, but we understand that Company A is the only sane person in the conversation. So our recommendation is get rid of passive voice. If there's a time frequency required, say it, specify it within 30 days. Add that to your compliance standards, make them stronger. And then so when we took all of our findings to our external evaluators, one key insight was that indeed all of our experts had seen these compliance standards used as a line-by-line checklist in reality, when I said, they should never be used that way. Additionally, we sent a randomized subset of our findings to them. They confirmed 36 out of 49 of them. The other 10 were plausible, that they hadn't actually seen them in their environment, but it is likely they could exist somewhere else. And the last one, we say they sort of kind of rejected 3 findings because in every instance of the rejection, the companies went above and beyond the security standards, but there's nothing inherently obvious as to why they did that other than just sound practice, and that another organization would not know to do that inherently. Now let's talk about our disclosure adventure. So when we worked with organizations such as US CERT, National Vulnerability Database, and MITRE to talk about these, they were really interested, and we had several months of back and forth conversations. But at the end of the day, we determined that this is really out of scope for them. What they deal with day in and day out is software with vulnerable conditions that can be patched. And they recommended that we talk to other federal entities for getting after this. So we went to the NIST headquarters, and we had about a 1-day conversation with them, and they recognized the problem at hand, where they're making guidelines that are being adopted as mandatory compliance controls, and they're being implemented as checklists. And so something they're looking at is deploying a complementary checklist for every one of their standards, so it helps with the ease of adoption. And then we went to the Department of Homeland Security. DHS had some federal agents that were really interested in working with us. However, their public affairs office gave us a cease communications order. The issue with this was the National Policy Program Directorate that's responsible for the compliance of the United States government that was unwilling to work with us on our findings. So not to be defeated there, we went forward directly to the authors. So the payment card industry was really receptive of a lot of our findings. Within weeks, the little network segment example I gave you was fixed for version 4 that's being rolled out this year, and other recommendations were being integrated. However, on the other end of the spectrum, the IRS ignored all of our phone calls, texts, emails, and there was only one website or one email address listed in the compliance standard, and we can't actually determine that it's even monitored. IRS had the document that hadn't been updated since 2006, and he started putting all this together as to why empirically it was the worst document that we evaluated. So our recommendations: if you're going to use something as a checklist, have a checklist for it. Don't assume things. Additionally, make strong language, active voice, specify frequencies. Additionally, we believe that organizations should do this internally. Look at all of the compliance standards that you have to deal with, make your own assessment, and then go above and beyond that. Identify the gaps, fix them on your own. I think that we identified a decent methodology for doing it that's repeatable, and we recommend that you look at it and try doing it in your own organizations. Additionally, there has to be some type of better disclosure process. If you're the user of PCI DSS and someone finds a vulnerable condition in it, wouldn't the entire community benefit from knowing about that? So in summary, we found 148 reasons why perfect compliance does not equate to perfect security. By tightening up some language, adding active voice, and by identifying ways to make the reporting process better, we think that we can start to make compliance standards a little bit better. And so I'd like to open up to any questions that you might have. Next.
So again, if you have any questions, please walk to the microphone. I want to start by asking, this is very, very interesting. I think that we all intuitively understand that there are some best practices or recommendations that actually are harmful for security, right? So it's great to see research that actually tries to quantify this and to measure it properly. So I wonder, in addition to these cases where you observe that the compliance standards actually encouraged bad security practices, what is your sense about how much these compliance standards actually improve security?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
So, looking at compliance standards and how they can help improve security over time. As we start moving to new technologies for bring your own device, moving off premises to the cloud, the ability to have a best practice that's been codified in industry and passed over to everyone that's a part of that community, I think is really important. And the fact that someone enforces it is a healthy thing. I think there's just better ways to do the enforcement. And additionally, something I didn't talk about in the talk is the electric grid corporations, they have zero tolerance. So if you're not in an evaluation cycle, you proactively disclose that there's a vulnerable condition in your environment, you're still fined for it, which is insanity. So, in the sake of transparency, being able to try new things, and then the nuances for the variable security thing that I talked about is when you have no tolerance policies like that, you don't want to go above and beyond. Because if you go above and beyond, you're going to get another fine for doing it wrong. So, I think there's better ways to have sticks and carrots that incentivize everyone moving up.
Yeah, I'm also curious about you mentioned that you received some feedback from the practitioners that you didn't find through your audits. So I'm curious about that as well.
And so there's one scenario where in the electric grid, it is okay, it is compliant to have systems with 0 passwords or 4-digit PINs, which we know takes seconds to brute force. And we've had that as a finding, and they're like, well, you need to understand the reason why. Okay, lay it on me. So the reason that a lot of these legacy systems are permitted to live on these environments is because they're critical services that they've never been taken offline. And to replace them means that something is no longer available at that particular time. It might not ever come back up. And additionally, replacing that costs money. And then so there's 2 problems with that. One, the physical hardware, the setup of that hardware with new software to replace the legacy systems. But then if you make an update to the compliance standard, the second it goes into effect, you are immediately susceptible to financial sanctions for being non-compliant. So if it's going to take you 10 years to replace it, every day you're non-compliant is a financial fine. So we just, that's something that I just had zero idea why. There was a lot of verbiage in the electric grid standards for when feasible. It's no, it's either compliant or it's not. Don't make but the when feasible is making provisions for when you have millions of dollars on the line.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. All right, so Any more? There's a question over there.
Yeah. Ingrid from Johns Hopkins. I have a question. You mentioned about like perfect compliance doesn't like equals to perfect security. So I was thinking about like on the other words about the compliance with like GDPR or California law without like equivalent to like perfect privacy, and would your approach like applicable to apply in the privacy world? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we intentionally, try to stay away from a lot of the healthcare community and privacy community because of, just lack of access to those resources for our study. Those are harder to get into. But absolutely, as you start looking at, how do you export our lessons learned to privacy and to healthcare, for like HIPAA, for example, it's absolutely necessary to consider, not just the data, but the individuals behind that data. And when you advocate for more transparency, you're not doing it just to keep this data sensitive. You're doing it because you're protecting people. And I think that's an interesting way to take the study forward, was looking at other people-based standards. Like credit cards, those can be replaced. If there's a fraudulent charge, you can, have that dealt with. But, people's privacy, that's huge.
Cool. Let's thank the speaker once more. This concludes this session.